The morning sun cast long shadows across the parking lot at Denver International Airport as David stepped out of his rental car. He stretched his back and rolled his shoulders, feeling the familiar ache that came from spending too many hours hunched over airport security reports. The past week had been exhausting, but it was the kind of work that mattered. As the regional security director for the Transportation Security Administration, David knew that every detail he observed could make the difference between a safe flight and a tragedy. He grabbed his small leather messenger bag from the passenger seat and locked the car. The bag contained his laptop, a few notebooks, and the kind of documentation that most travelers never saw. David had been conducting surprise security evaluations at airports across the region, and Denver was his final stop before heading home to his family in Atlanta. The cool Colorado air felt refreshing after the stuffiness of airplane cabins and hotel rooms. David pulled out his phone to check his flight time. 3 hours until departure, which gave him plenty of time to complete his final observations and maybe grab a decent cup of coffee. He had deliberately dressed casually today, wearing dark jeans and a simple gray polo shirt. When you worked in airport security, blending in with regular passengers was essential. You couldn't spot problems if everyone knew you were watching. As he walked toward the terminal entrance, David's trained eye automatically began cataloging details. The flow of passenger traffic seemed normal for a Tuesday morning. The exterior security cameras were positioned correctly, and he noticed that the maintenance crews were following proper protocols for accessing restricted areas. These were the kinds of observations that filled his reports, the small details that collectively created a secure environment. The automatic doors slid open with a soft whoosh, and David stepped into the busy terminal. The familiar sounds of airport life surrounded him, rolling luggage wheels clicking against tile floors, the distant hum of announcements over the intercom, children asking their parents when they would board the plane, and the constant background noise of hundreds of conversations in multiple languages. David paused near a coffee shop to get his bearings. Terminal B stretched out before him, with its maze of shops, restaurants, and seating areas leading toward the security checkpoint. This was where his real work would begin. He had spent the previous day observing operations from the restricted side, working with the local TSA supervisors to review procedures and protocols. Today, he wanted to see things from the passenger perspective. He pulled out a small black notebook from his back pocket and jotted down his arrival time. The notebook looked unremarkable, the kind that students might use for class notes or business people might carry for meetings. But for David, it was an essential tool. Every observation, every timing, every potential improvement opportunity would be recorded in these pages. Walking slowly through the terminal, David began his assessment. He watched how passengers moved through the space, where bottlenecks formed, and how staff members interacted with travelers. Near the security checkpoint, he noticed a family struggling with their luggage and watched how long it took for an airport employee to offer assistance. 47 seconds. He made a note. The security line was moving at a reasonable pace for this time of day. David observed the passenger screening process from a distance, noting the efficiency of the document checking station and the flow through the metal detectors. He had reviewed the staffing schedules earlier and knew that the morning shift supervisor had implemented some new procedures based on recommendations from his previous visits. A young mother was having trouble managing her toddler and her carry-on bag while preparing for security screening. David watched as a TSA officer approached and offered to help her organize her belongings. The interaction was professional and kind, exactly the kind of customer service that made air travel less stressful for families. He made another note in his book. Moving to a seating area with a clear view of the checkpoint, David settled into a chair and opened his laptop. To anyone watching, he looked like a typical business traveler catching up on emails before his flight. In reality, he was reviewing security footage from the previous day and comparing it with his live observations. The laptop screen showed timing data, passenger volume statistics, and incident reports that helped him understand the bigger picture of airport operations. As he worked, David noticed the subtle rhythms of airport security, the way officers rotated positions to prevent fatigue, the careful coordination between different agencies when suspicious items were detected. the constant radio communication that kept everyone informed and alert. These were the invisible systems that kept millions of passengers safe every year. His phone buzzed with a text message from his wife asking about his flight time. David smiled as he typed back that everything was on schedule and he would be home for dinner. After 5 days of hotel rooms and airport food, the thought of his wife's cooking and his daughter's bedtime stories felt like the greatest luxury in the world. A commotion near the checkpoint caught his attention. A passenger was arguing with a TSA officer about the contents of his carry-on bag. David watched the situation carefully, noting how the officers handled the escalation. The lead officer remained calm and professional, explaining the regulations clearly while other officers maintained awareness of their surroundings. The situation was resolved without incident, but David made notes about passenger education opportunities that might prevent similar conflicts. The morning crowd was beginning to thin as the rush of early flights departed. David used this quieter time to move closer to the checkpoint and observe the detailed procedures. He watched officers conducting random additional screenings, noting their adherence to protocol and their interaction skills with passengers. Every few minutes he would step aside and update his notes, building a comprehensive picture of the operation's strengths and areas for improvement. Near the gate area, David found another observation point where he could watch the boarding process. This was often where security concerns surfaced, as passengers sometimes revealed suspicious behavior once they thought the screening process was complete. He watched flight crews conducting their pre-boarding checks and noted the coordination between gate agents and security personnel. As his own departure time approached, David reflected on what he had observed over the past week. Each airport had its unique challenges and strengths, but the dedication of the security professionals remained constant. These men and women came to work every day, knowing that their vigilance protected countless lives. It was a responsibility that David took seriously, and one that motivated every recommendation in his reports. He closed his laptop and gathered his belongings, preparing to transition from observer to passenger. In a few hours he would be just another traveler making his way home. But the observations from this trip would influence security procedures at airports across the region, making air travel safer for everyone who followed in his footsteps. Officer Lisa Chen adjusted her radio and glanced at her partner, Officer Mike Rodriguez, as they began their routine patrol through Terminal B. It was their third lap of the morning, and the familiar rhythm of airport security work had settled into their steps. Lisa had been working airport security for 6 years, and she prided herself on being able to spot unusual behavior from across a crowded terminal. The morning rush was winding down, which meant it was time to pay closer attention to individual passengers rather than managing crowd flow. Lisa's training had taught her that potential threats often revealed themselves during quieter periods, when suspicious individuals thought they were less likely to be noticed. As they walked past the coffee shops and gift stores, Mike pointed out a maintenance worker who wasn't wearing proper identification badges. Lisa made a mental note to follow up on that after they completed their current sweep. These small details mattered in airport security. Every person in the terminal had a reason to be there, and everyone should be easily identifiable. Near the ICU seating area closest to the security checkpoint, Lisa noticed a man sitting alone with a laptop. There was something about him that caught her attention. He was well-dressed but casual, the kind of person who traveled frequently for business. But his behavior seemed different from the typical business traveler rushing to catch a flight or killing time between connections. The man appeared to be studying the security checkpoint with unusual intensity. Lisa watched as his eyes tracked the movement of TSA officers, following their rotation patterns and noting their procedures. When a minor incident occurred at the screening area, his attention became even more focused, and he pulled out a small notebook to write something down. Lisa nudged Mike and nodded in the man's direction. "See the guy with the laptop near gate 15? Something feels off about him." Mike followed her gaze and observed the passenger for several moments. "What are you thinking?" "Look at what he's doing. He's not reading emails or browsing the internet. Like most people. He's watching our operations and taking notes. That's not normal passenger behavior." They positioned themselves where they could observe, without being obvious. Lisa had learned early in her career that suspicious activity often looked completely normal on the surface. The key was noticing patterns that didn't fit typical passenger behavior. The man closed his laptop and moved to a different location, one that provided a better view of the document checking station. Lisa felt her suspicions growing, stronger. Why would a regular passenger need multiple vantage points of the security process? And why was he so interested in officer positions and procedures? He's conducting surveillance, Lisa whispered to Mike. Look how he's mapping our security setup. Mike radioed their supervisor while maintaining visual contact with the subject. Control, this is Unit 7. We have a possible surveillance situation in Terminal B. Request backup for observation and possible approach. The man seemed completely absorbed in his work, oblivious to the attention he was attracting. He moved again, this time to a position where he could observe both the screening area and the gate boarding processes. Lisa noticed that he timed these movements carefully, almost as if he was coordinating them with shift changes or procedural rotations. When the man pulled out his phone and appeared to be taking photos or video, Lisa's concern escalated to alarm. Photography of security procedures was strictly prohibited, and anyone attempting to document airport security operations was automatically considered a potential threat. Control, subject, is now engaged in possible photography of security operations, Mike reported. We need to make contact immediately. Lisa's heart rate increased as she prepared for what could be a dangerous confrontation. She had dealt with suspicious passengers before, but something about this situation felt more serious. The man's systematic approach to observing their operations suggested a level of planning that went beyond casual curiosity. Other officers began converging on their location, taking discreet positions throughout the terminal. Lisa was grateful for their training and coordinated responses. If this passenger was planning something harmful, they needed to be prepared for any possibility. The man stood up and began walking toward the departure gates, still carrying his notebook and laptop. Lisa and Mike followed at a distance, maintaining radio contact with the other officers. The man's pace was unhurried, but his eyes continued to scan the security cameras and officer positions as he walked. Near Gate 18, the man stopped and pulled out his phone again. This time Lisa was certain he was photographing the security setup. She could see him adjusting his position to get better angles of the camera locations and emergency response equipment. That's enough, Lisa said into her radio. We're making contact now. As they approached, Lisa reviewed her training on handling potential threats. Stay calm, maintain safe distances, and always assume the subject might be armed or dangerous. The man's behavior had crossed the line from suspicious to potentially threatening, and they couldn't afford to wait any longer. Mike positioned himself to block any escape route toward the secured area, while Lisa prepared to make the initial contact. Other officers moved into supporting positions, creating a perimeter that would prevent the subject from fleeing into the crowd. The man was still focused on his phone when Lisa decided they had seen enough. His systematic documentation of security procedures combined with his apparent photography of restricted areas created a clear pattern of surveillance activity. In the post-9/11 world of airport security, such behavior couldn't be ignored or explained away as innocent curiosity. Lisa thought about the thousands of passengers who would pass through this terminal today, trusting that security professionals like her would keep them safe. Every suspicious activity had to be investigated thoroughly, regardless of how the subject might react. Better to err on the side of caution than to miss a potential threat. The man finally looked up from his phone, seemingly unaware that he was being watched by multiple security officers. Lisa noticed that he appeared confident and relaxed, which could indicate either innocence or professional training in avoiding detection. Either way, they needed answers about his activities. Remember? Lisa said quietly to Mike. He could be armed and we don't know if he's working alone. Stay alert and be ready for anything. Mike nodded, checking his position relative to the other officers. Control confirms all units are in position. We're clear to approach. Lisa took a deep breath. and began walking directly toward the man. Her years of training had prepared her for moments like this, when split-second decisions could mean the difference between preventing an attack and becoming a victim of one. The man's systematic surveillance of their security operations had raised too many red flags to ignore. As she got closer, Lisa noticed more details about the subject. He was probably in his 30s, appeared to be in good physical condition, and carried himself with the kind of confidence that suggested either complete innocence or professional experience in law enforcement or military service. Both possibilities made the situation more unpredictable. The man was returning his phone to his pocket when Lisa made her final approach. In a few seconds, she would find out whether her suspicions were justified or whether she was about to make a very embarrassing mistake. But in airport security, embarrassment was always preferable to tragedy. The other passengers in the area continued with their travel routines, unaware that a potential security situation was unfolding just a few feet away. Lisa's training had taught her to handle such situations with minimal disruption to normal operations, but she was prepared to escalate quickly if the subject's behavior warranted it. As she closed the final distance, Lisa's hand moved instinctively toward her radio. Whatever happened in the next few minutes would determine whether this was a successful interception of a security threat or a case study in the challenges of balancing vigilance with passenger rights. David was putting his phone back in his pocket when he heard a firm voice behind him. "Sir, I need you to stop where you are and keep your hands visible." He turned around to find himself facing a female security officer with her hand resting on her radio. Behind her, he could see at least 3 other officers positioned at various points around the gate area. The professional way they had positioned themselves told David immediately that this wasn't a routine passenger interaction. "Is there a problem, officer?" David asked, keeping his voice calm and his hands clearly visible. His years of law enforcement training kicked in automatically. When you found yourself on the wrong side of a security situation, the most important thing was to avoid escalating tensions. "We need to ask you some questions about your activities in the terminal today," Officer Chen replied. "Please place your hands behind your back and step over here away from the other passengers." David could feel the eyes of nearby travelers turning toward them. A few people were already reaching for their phones, and he knew that within minutes, video of this interaction would probably be uploaded to social media. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on him, but he also understood exactly why these officers were suspicious. "Of course, I'm happy to cooperate," David said, slowly moving his hands behind his back as requested. "But may I ask what specific behavior has caused concern?" Officer Rodriguez stepped closer, maintaining a professional but guarded posture. "Sir, we've been observing you for the past hour, and your behavior indicates possible surveillance of our security operations. You've been photographing restricted areas and taking detailed notes about our procedures." David almost smiled at the accuracy of their observations. These officers had been doing their job exactly as they should. He had indeed been studying their operations, timing their procedures, and documenting everything he observed. From their perspective, his behavior was textbook suspicious activity. "Officers, I understand why you're concerned, and I want to assure you that I'm happy to explain everything," David said. "However, I think you're going to find this situation is not what it appears to be." Officer Chen gestured toward a more private area near the gate counter. "Sir, we're going to need to see some identification and get a full explanation of what you've been doing here today." As they walked toward the designated area, David noticed how professionally the officers were handling the situation. They maintained proper spacing, kept their radio communication quiet, and managed to move him away from the main passenger flow without creating a significant disruption. Their training was evident in every aspect of their response. The gate area they moved to was relatively quiet, with only a few passengers waiting for a delayed flight to Chicago. David could see that the officers had chosen this location carefully to minimize the audience, while maintaining clear sight lines to potential escape routes. Everything about their approach demonstrated competence and experience. "Sir, I'm Officer Chen, and this is Officer Rodriguez," the lead officer said. "We're going to need you to slowly remove your identification from your wallet and place it on this counter." David reached carefully for his wallet, making sure his movements were deliberate and non-threatening. Officers, before I show you my identification, I want you to know that this situation is about to become very interesting. I'm reaching for my wallet now. He pulled out his driver's license first, placing it on the counter as requested. Then, he reached for a second item in his wallet, a government identification card that would change the entire dynamic of this encounter. I'm also going to show you my RK identification, David said, placing the TSA Regional Security Director credentials next to his driver's license. Officer Chen picked up the TSA identification card and examined it carefully. David could see the moment when the implications of what she was reading began to sink in. Her eyes moved from the photo to David's face, then back to the title printed clearly on the card. This says you're a regional security director for the Transportation Security Administration, she said, her voice betraying the first hint of uncertainty. That's correct, David replied. I've been conducting authorized security evaluations at this airport for the past 2 days. Everything you observed me doing was part of my official duties. Officer Rodriguez took the identification card from his partner and studied it closely. Sir, how do we know this identification is legitimate? These cards can be forged. David nodded approvingly. You're absolutely right to verify everything. I would recommend contacting your shift supervisor or the airport security coordinator. They should have been briefed about my presence here. You can also call TSA headquarters for verification. The other officers who had been providing backup began moving closer, sensing that the situation had taken an unexpected turn. David could see them trying to read the body language of their colleagues and understand what was happening. Officer Chen spoke into her radio. Control, we need immediate verification of TSA credentials for a subject claiming to be Regional Security Director David Williams, also requesting supervisor response to Gate 18. While they waited for verification, an uncomfortable silence settled over the group. David could see the wheels turning in the officers' minds as they began to realize they might have just detained their own boss's boss. The professional confidence they had displayed earlier was beginning to show cracks. Sir? Officer Rodriguez asked hesitantly. If you're really TSA management, why didn't you identify yourself when we first approached? Because you handled the situation exactly as you should have, David replied. Your observations were accurate, your response was professional, and your caution was appropriate. A person in my position should expect to be questioned if their behavior appears suspicious, regardless of who they are. Officer Chen's radio crackled to life with a response from their supervisor. All units stand down immediately. Subject is confirmed legitimate TSA personnel conducting authorized operations. Supervisor en route. The relief and embarrassment on the officers' faces was immediately apparent. David watched as they processed the reality that they had just detained and questioned one of the highest-ranking security officials in the region while he was doing his job. Oh my God, Officer Chen whispered, the professional composure finally cracking. Sir, I am so sorry. We had no idea. Officer Chen. David interrupted gently. Please don't apologize. You did nothing wrong. In fact, you did everything right. This is exactly how suspicious behavior should be investigated. A small crowd of passengers had gathered at a respectful distance, drawn by the obvious drama of the situation. Several were still recording with their phones, capturing what they probably thought was an incident of security overreach. David knew that managing the aftermath of this situation would be just as important as how it had been handled initially. Officer Rodriguez looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. Sir, we're going to be in so much trouble for this. I can't believe we just... Stop right there, David said firmly but kindly. You're not in trouble. You identified suspicious behavior. You investigated it properly, and you handled a potentially dangerous situation with professionalism and restraint. That's exactly what you're trained to do. The sound of approaching footsteps announced the arrival of the shift supervisor, who was moving quickly toward their location. David could see the supervisor trying to assess the situation from a distance, probably wondering why his officers had detained someone who was clearly cooperating without resistance. As the supervisor got closer, David could see the moment of recognition. The man's pace slowed, and his expression changed from urgency to confusion to what looked like barely controlled panic. "Mr. Williams," the supervisor called out as he approached, "I am so incredibly sorry about this misunderstanding." David held up his hand to stop the apology. "Supervisor Johnson, your officers did outstanding work today. They identified suspicious behavior, responded appropriately, and handled a complex situation with skill and professionalism. I couldn't be more impressed with their performance." The gathered passengers were beginning to realize that they had witnessed something unusual, though most probably still didn't understand the full context of what had happened. David knew that the real work of this encounter was just beginning. Supervisor Johnson approached the group with a mixture of relief and apprehension visible on his face. David could see that the man was trying to process how a routine security response had somehow resulted in the detention of one of the most senior TSA officials in the region. "Mr. Williams, I received the notification about your evaluation visit, but I had no idea you were conducting passenger-side observations today," Johnson said, slightly out of breath from his hurried response to the scene. David nodded toward officers, Chen and Rodriguez, who were still standing nearby, looking uncertain about their next move. "Supervisor Johnson, these officers demonstrated exactly the kind of vigilance and professionalism that makes our airport security system work. They observed suspicious behavior, investigated it thoroughly, and handled the entire situation by the book." Officer Chen stepped forward, her professional composure returning despite the obvious embarrassment. "Sir, with respect, we should have verified your credentials before taking any action. We made assumptions based on your behavior without considering other explanations." "Officer Chen, walk me through exactly what you observed," David replied. "I want to understand your thought process from the beginning." Chen glanced at her partner before responding. "We noticed you studying our security checkpoint operations for an extended period. You were taking notes, photographing what appeared to be restricted areas, and positioning yourself to observe different aspects of our procedures. Your behavior was consistent with someone conducting surveillance for potentially harmful purposes." David pulled out his small black notebook and showed it to the officers. "You're absolutely correct. I was documenting everything I observed. I took photos of camera angles, timed your response procedures, and mapped your staffing rotations. From your perspective, that behavior should have raised immediate red flags." Officer Rodriguez looked puzzled. "But sir, if you knew your behavior looked suspicious, why didn't you coordinate with us beforehand?" "Because the most valuable security assessments happen when personnel are operating under normal conditions," David explained. "If everyone knows they're being evaluated, they modify their behavior. I needed to see how the system actually works, not how it works when everyone is on their best behavior." Supervisor Johnson nodded in understanding. "The unannounced evaluations always provide the most accurate picture of our real capabilities and vulnerabilities." A small group of passengers was still watching the interaction from a distance, some recording with their phones. David noticed an elderly couple who seemed particularly concerned about what they had witnessed. The woman was speaking quietly to her husband, probably wondering if they were safe traveling through an airport where passengers were being detained. "Officers, this situation highlights something important that goes beyond security procedures," David said. "The passengers who witnessed this encounter saw a well-dressed black man being questioned and detained by security personnel. Some of them are probably wondering if this was racially motivated." Officer Chen's expression grew troubled. "Sir, your race had nothing to do with our decision to investigate. We were responding solely to behavior that appeared suspicious." "I believe that's true," David replied. "But perception matters just as much as reality in public safety. Some of those passengers recording this incident might interpret what they saw very differently than the facts actually support." David gestured toward the small crowd of onlookers. "This is why it's crucial that every interaction we have with the public is beyond reproach. We need to be conscious not just of what we're doing, but of how our actions might be perceived by people who don't have the full context." Officer Rodriguez shifted uncomfortably. "How should we have handled the situation differently?" "You shouldn't have handled it differently," David emphasized. "You followed proper procedures, maintained professionalism, and verified information before taking any irreversible actions." The fact that I happen to be TSA personnel doesn't change the validity of your response to what appeared to be suspicious activity. Supervisor Johnson looked relieved to hear David's assessment. Mr. Williams, should we be concerned about any negative fallout from this incident? David considered the question carefully. The passengers with phones had certainly captured enough footage to create a viral social media post if they chose to. The story of a black man being detained by airport security would generate significant attention, regardless of the actual facts of the situation. Supervisor Johnson, I want you to prepare a detailed incident report documenting exactly what happened here today, David said. Inc. Viewed the officers' observations, their decision-making process, and the professional manner in which they handled the entire situation. He turned back to Officers Chen and Rodriguez. I also want both of you to document your perspective on this encounter. Focus on what you observed, why you decided to investigate, and how you managed the interaction. Officer Chen looked concerned. Sir, are we going to be disciplined for this? Quite the opposite, David replied. This incident is going to become a case study in how airport security should work. You identified suspicious behavior, investigated it appropriately, and resolved the situation professionally. That's exactly what we train officers to do. A TSA supervisor approached the group, having been alerted by radio communications about the situation. David recognized him as one of the local administrators he had worked with during his evaluation. Mr. Williams, I just heard about what happened, the supervisor said. Are there any concerns we need to address immediately? David shook his head. Actually, this incident demonstrates that your officers are doing their jobs extremely well. They were alert, professional, and thorough in their investigation of what appeared to be a legitimate security concern. The gathering crowd of passengers was beginning to disperse as it became clear that the situation was resolving peacefully. David noticed that several people were still recording, probably hoping to capture some dramatic conclusion to what they had witnessed. Officers Chen and Rodriguez, David said, I want you to know that your actions today will be commended in my report to headquarters. You demonstrated the kind of vigilance and professionalism that keeps our transportation system secure. Officer Rodriguez still looked uncertain. Sir, with respect, it feels like we made a significant mistake in judgment. Let me ask you something, David replied. If I had been a real security threat conducting surveillance for harmful purposes, how would you feel about not investigating my behavior? The question seemed to put the situation in perspective for both officers. Officer Chen straightened her posture slightly. We would never forgive ourselves if we ignored suspicious activity, and something bad happened as a result. Exactly, David said. The cost of investigating innocent behavior is temporary embarrassment. The cost of not investigating dangerous behavior could be catastrophic. You made the right choice with the information you had available. Supervisor Johnson checked his watch. Mr. Williams, your flight is probably boarding soon. Is there anything else we need to address before you depart? David looked around at the group of security personnel who had responded to the situation. Each of them had done their job professionally and competently, even when faced with an unexpected and potentially embarrassing situation. There is one more thing, David said. This incident is going to generate discussion about racial profiling in airport security. I want everyone to understand that what happened here today was not about race. It was about behavior. But we need to be prepared to explain that distinction clearly and convincingly. Officer Chen nodded thoughtfully. How do we address those concerns if they arise? By being transparent about our procedures and consistent in our application of security protocols, David replied. We investigate suspicious behavior regardless of who exhibits it, and we treat every passenger with respect and dignity throughout the process. The situation was winding down, but David knew that the real impact of this encounter would unfold over the coming days and weeks. How the officers, supervisors, and TSA leadership handled the aftermath would be just as important as how the initial incident was managed. As he prepared to head toward his gate for boarding, David reflected on the unexpected turn his routine evaluation had taken. Sometimes the most valuable lessons came from the situations you never planned for. 3 months later, David sat in his Atlanta office reviewing the quarterly security assessment reports from airports across his region. The Denver incident had, indeed, become a case study, but not in the way anyone had initially expected. Instead of becoming a public relations nightmare, it had sparked important conversations about security procedures, unconscious bias, and the delicate balance between vigilance and passenger rights. The incident report had been thorough and honest, documenting every aspect of the encounter from multiple perspectives. What emerged was a clear picture of security professionals doing their jobs correctly under challenging circumstances. The officers had identified legitimate suspicious behavior, investigated it appropriately, and handled the situation with professionalism throughout. David's phone rang, interrupting his review of the reports. The caller ID showed it was Supervisor Johnson from Denver International Airport. "Good morning, David. I wanted to give you an update on how things have developed since your visit," Johnson said. "I'm listening," David replied, setting aside the stack of reports. "Officers Chen and Rodriguez completed the advanced training program you recommended. The focus on cultural competency and bias recognition has made a real difference in how they approach passenger interactions. Chen, in particular, has become one of our most effective officers for handling difficult situations." David smiled, remembering how professional both officers had been during their encounter. "That doesn't surprise me. They demonstrated excellent judgment and composure under pressure." "There's more," Johnson continued. "The incident has led to some policy changes at the regional level. We now have better coordination procedures for when senior officials are conducting evaluations. But more importantly, we've implemented new training protocols that address the exact issues that came up during your detention." The training program had been David's idea, developed in collaboration with headquarters after the Denver incident. It focused on helping officers recognize and address their own unconscious biases while maintaining the vigilance necessary for effective security work. "How has the staff responded to the new training?" David asked. "Better than expected," Johnson replied. "When we explained that the training was developed because of a real incident involving one of our own officials, it gave the lessons more credibility. Officers understand that even the most professional personnel can benefit from examining their assumptions and decision-making processes." David had spent considerable time developing the training curriculum, working with psychologists and security experts to create modules that were both practical and meaningful. The goal was not to make officers second-guess their instincts, but to help them recognize when additional verification might be appropriate. "What about the public response?" David asked. "Did the video footage from that day ever surface online?" "Surprisingly, no," Johnson said. "We reached out to the passengers who were recording, explained the situation, and most of them agreed that posting the video would be misleading without the full context. A few even thanked us for being transparent about what had happened." This had been one of David's biggest concerns in the immediate aftermath of the incident. In an era of viral videos and social media outrage, even a completely justified security action could be misinterpreted and cause significant damage to public trust. David's assistant knocked on his office door, signaling that his next appointment had arrived. "Johnson, I need to wrap up, but I want to thank you for the follow-up. The fact that your team turned this incident into a learning opportunity speaks well of your leadership." "Actually, David, there's one more thing you should know," Johnson said. "Officer Chen asked me to tell you that the incident changed how she thinks about her job. She said it reminded her that good security work isn't just about following procedures, but about understanding the impact of those procedures on real people." After ending the call, David reflected on how the Denver incident had influenced his own thinking about airport security. The encounter had reinforced his belief that the human element was both the greatest strength and the biggest challenge in security work. His next meeting was with a group of newly promoted supervisors from airports across the Southeast region. David had decided to use the Denver incident as a centerpiece of their training, showing them how a potentially negative situation could be transformed into an opportunity for improvement. As the supervisors filed into the conference room, David noticed the diversity of backgrounds and experiences represented in the group. Some were former military personnel, others had come up through civilian law enforcement, and a few had started as frontline TSA officers and worked their way into leadership positions. "Good morning, everyone," David began. "Today we're going to discuss a case study that hits close to home. 3 months ago, I was detained and questioned by airport security officers while conducting an evaluation at Denver International Airport." The room fell silent as the supervisors processed this unexpected opening. David could see various expressions of surprise, concern, and curiosity on their faces. "The officers who detained me did absolutely nothing wrong," David continued. "In fact, they demonstrated exactly the kind of professional vigilance that makes our security system effective. But the incident taught all of us some valuable lessons about perception, communication, and the importance of continuous training." Over the next hour, David walked the supervisors through every aspect of the Denver encounter. He showed them the incident reports, discussed the officers' decision-making process, and explained how the situation had been resolved professionally despite its potentially embarrassing nature. The key lesson here is that good security work sometimes creates difficult situations, David explained. "Our job as leaders is to support our officers when they make tough calls, even when those calls result in uncomfortable moments." One of the supervisors raised her hand. "How do we balance the need for vigilance with concerns about racial profiling or discriminatory enforcement?" "That's exactly the right question," David replied. "The answer is training, transparency, and consistency. We investigate suspicious behavior regardless of who exhibits it, and we document our decision-making process so that we can review and improve our procedures." Another supervisor asked about managing public perception when security actions are misunderstood or taken out of context. "Transparency is our best defense," David said. "When we can clearly explain why we took certain actions and demonstrate that those actions were justified and professional, most reasonable people will understand and support our decisions." The discussion continued for another hour, with supervisors sharing their own experiences and challenges. David was impressed by their thoughtfulness and commitment to both security and fairness. As the meeting concluded, David handed out copies of the new training materials that had been developed after the Denver incident. "I want each of your airports to implement these training modules over the next quarter. The goal is not to make officers afraid to act when they observe suspicious behavior, but to help them recognize and address their own biases while maintaining operational effectiveness." Walking back to his office after the meeting, David thought about Officer Chen and Rodriguez. According to Johnson, both had embraced the additional training and had become even more effective in their roles. The incident that could have ended, their careers had instead become a catalyst for professional growth. David's phone buzzed with a text message from his wife, reminding him about their daughter's school play that evening. He smiled, thinking about how different his life was from the dramatic events that had unfolded in Denver 3 months earlier. The incident had taught him that security work was ultimately about people, not just procedures. Every passenger who passed through an airport checkpoint was someone's family member, traveling for reasons that mattered deeply to them. Every security officer was a professional trying to do a difficult job while balancing competing demands and pressures. As he settled back into his office chair, David opened his laptop and began working on his next quarterly report. The Denver incident would be featured prominently, not as a failure or embarrassment, but as an example of how security professionals could learn and grow from challenging situations. The final paragraph of his report read, "Effective airport security requires constant vigilance, professional judgment, and the wisdom to learn from every encounter. The measure of our success is not whether we avoid difficult situations, but whether we handle them with integrity, professionalism, and a commitment to continuous improvement." David saved the document and leaned back in his chair, satisfied that the lessons from Denver would continue to make airport security stronger and more fair for everyone involved.